Since the dawn of man, Pokemon's type chart has remained rigid and unchanging, so long as you count Generation 2 as the dawn of man, and only up until Generation 6, which actually means it's almost been as long since the introduction of Fairy-type as it was between that and the introduction of Steel and Dark. And okay, technically they've added Stellar-type, but I doubt that a type that only one Pokemon has sometimes and is inherently linked with a gimmick that's specific to one generation is gonna be a new mainstay. So is there perhaps a world where they actually change up the type chart again? Would we really need another new type, or should some existing types simply be adjusted? And what problems might there be in the first place that need to be solved by changing the type chart? Pokemon's types are a carefully crafted web of ideas that I always find fun to mess around with, and I mainly just like thinking about some ways they could be changed if I had my grubby little mitts on them, but I at least want to have a core purpose for why we would change Pokemon's current types. And when it comes to actual logistical issues with the existing types, there aren't really any that I see discussed online because most fans are used to how this chart works. What each type represents, why each type has a certain effectiveness on other types, and that sometimes things are one way just because of game balancing above anything else. But that's why, to me, the real biggest issue a Pokemon type can have is restricting the creativity of a Pokemon design. I think that what types do and don't exist and how they exist have a direct impact on what designs are made. So, what types may be limiting the designs that are possible? I'm gonna start with a bold one. I think Pokemon is being too limited by the flying type. Back in Generation 1, there existed an unused typing in the code, Bird type, and I think the general idea of the Bird type tainted our current flying type. Flying, in theory, is just the air element of a classic setup of magical elements, and yet flying is almost exclusively used for its literal meaning, a creature that flies, which I think is why we don't have many designs just based on the magical element idea of air. Now, okay, we don't have confirmation that bird type was an early form of flying. In fact, flying type had a lower index number than bird in that game, suggesting that it was implemented first and may have existed in addition to bird. But that's actually what I want. I think flying should be split up into a bird type and an air type. It may feel a little weird to suggest a Pokemon type that's just a classification of animal, but that's what bug type is, so if anything, bird is a perfect counterpart to that. In the meantime, air can pick up those few Pokemon who are already not just creatures who fly, like Rotom Fan, Minior, Driftblim, Castform, who is currently a normal type but would obviously become air type, or all those Cloud Genies from Gen 5. Those are the types of designs I think we could easily have more of, but currently don't because of how flying type is thought of. And if you're worried about air and bird being too similar to each other, then I present my expert judgment of type similarities. Can I imagine a Pokemon who would fittingly be both types? And yes, there's already existing Pokemon designs like Swablu who could easily be bird and air type. Okay, well, that's kinda the only one, but look, Pokemon doesn't make designs for types that don't exist. So just the fact that there's already a decent amount of existing Pokemon that could flesh out an air type shows me that there's already plenty of ideas and room to grow from. This would even help with some type matchup logic. I'm not a competitive expert or anything, so I'm not going to worry too much about game balancing, but the logic of type effectiveness is something I can talk about and does play into whether a type should exist or not. And currently, all of Flying's existing type matchups actually work better under the idea of being bird type. Meanwhile, splitting air type on its own would allow for some better logic that... Okay, I'll be fair, it's probably just going to be largely based on game balance, unfortunately. Like, in real life, both ground and water disperse electricity, but in Pokemon, one is immune to electric and the other is weak to it, so I can't even be like, in real life, oxygen would be weak to this, because it's kind of arbitrary. Maybe air is super effective on ground because wind can erode the earth, but like, heat rises, does that mean air resists fire, or is it weak to fire because fire uses oxygen to stay burning? It's quite flexible, but at least there are clear ideas flowing, which means that type matchups won't be an issue with this idea. But I will acknowledge that there's some obvious logistical issues in the fact that bird does not actually account for all animals who fly. You know, the goal was to split it up into magical air and creatures with flight, but it might be a little weird to see a bat considered a bird, but it can't be an air elemental either, so as much as I'd love to tank the normal flying dual type stock market by turning them all into pure bird types and completely ruin Larry's entire gimmick, I suppose it makes more sense to keep the creatures that can fly type as flying type. Unfortunately, that kind of reintroduces a couple issues, like how there's not really a good example of a dual air flying type now. I mean, maybe it'd be a balloon, or maybe Tornadus, that guy could use a job, but we also now bring back some of the issues of type matchups, like the fact that rock being super effective against flying was, I think, only because of the whole 2 birds, 1 stone phrase. So like, that would have been solved beautifully by having flying turn into bird type, but instead we have to return to being like, yeah, sure, I guess a rock would be a decently effective weapon against a bat. Although you could also argue that the issue lies only in the name of the type. Theoretically, Pokemon could start using the flying type for things that control air but don't necessarily fly. Even if it doesn't fit the name, this hasn't really stopped them before. Steel type obviously contains Pokemon that are explicitly not made of steel, it just functions as the metal type. Same thing with grass type, it's not just grass-based Pokemon, it's the plant type. The big difference is that if those were renamed to metal type or plant type, they'd work perfectly, but changing flying to air might be a little more confusing with some of the existing flying types, and having flying types with no flight isn't as excusable as having copper Pokemon in steel type. I'd say something more similar to flying situation is bug type. Despite being implied to be about insects, bug applies a lot more broadly to lots of different creatures that are vaguely similar to insects. Arachnids? Sure, close enough to bugs, I guess. Most people make that mistake anyway. Trilobites? That's, I guess, still kinda close to a bug. Scorpions? That's just an arthropod. Crabs? You put a crab in the bug type? And okay, maybe you could argue that this is just a case of needing to change the name. Steel is really metal type, grass is really plant type, and bug is really arthropod type. But you can tell in this case that they do try to avoid this broader use. All spider Pokemon are bug type, but Kabuto, who is a horseshoe crab, which despite the name is actually an arachnid, is not a bug type. Krabby is actually a crab and wasn't bug type, despite Dwebble, a hermit crab, being one. And Skorupi is the only scorpion Pokemon to be bug type, despite the fact that all scorpions are arachnids too. Did you know that? That's kind of wild, right? Scorpions are arachnids. Sure, most crustaceans are just water type, most spiders, bug. And that mostly works. Sometimes it can feel like they're being forced to reshape a design to what types actually exist, rather than letting the ideas flow freely, but I think it's fine in this case. They may not be bugs, but honestly, I tend to love when Pokemon stretches the boundaries of a type a bit to work in things that are kind of close to it. So I think it's much better having weird edge cases of type classification, rather than being stuck trying to make enough crustacean type or arachnid type Pokemon to justify it being an entirely separate category. Though I think there is an example of an existing type that feels like that. Feels like they don't have enough variety of ideas for it. The existence of a type forces Pokemon to make designs for it, even when there might not be enough ideas to keep an interesting variety of Pokemon designs. And this is a point that I have seen discussed by others, disguised under a fairly common suggestion. Combine rock and ground into a new Earth type. Pokemon doesn't really struggle to create geological designs that can be either rock or ground type, but there's an argument to be made that they're struggling to make enough of both without being boring. Ground type is pretty vague, so it can encompass a lot of stuff, but rock is kinda just rocks. And to bring back my earlier method of, are these distinct enough types that I can imagine a Pokemon who would make perfect sense to be both types at the same time? Honestly, all dual rock-ground type Pokemon feel like they could easily just be one or the other. So perhaps a big Earth type would help the variety of designs and allow any geological themes to easily fit in this one type without forcing us to have a basic rock creature in every single generation. Though, despite this being the only idea I've heard discussed already, it's also the one I actually have the most issues with. First is that Earth doesn't really feel like it would include rocks. It honestly just sounds like a different version of ground, but with plants involved, and like, we don't need to get grass type involved in this. Similarly, when thinking of type matchups for Earth, the most logical options are essentially just ground type again, with rock being almost entirely uninvolved. Lastly is that a combined Earth type brings with it the second major issue that some types have that I think is limiting creativity. And it's a problem that I feel like is more important than having types that are potentially too niche. Some types are so all-encompassing that they just lead to boring ideas. To me, the creative edge cases are some of my favorite ways that Pokemon uses its type chart. But Earth type is too accommodating, because it would include multiple major categories that feel so different within one type. Of course, that's just because it's a combination of two types that I think work perfectly fine on their own. Ground may be a little vague, but it tends to focus on dirt, clay, and sand, while rock is largely focused on stones and ores. I think the best way to describe it is that ground is soft, while rock is hard. And because of this, they have their own clever subcategories, like rock includes crystals, coal, salt, and even coral. And on the other side, ground includes bone for some reason. I know bone isn't soft, so that doesn't really make sense for the ground type, but I like that it's there and I wish they did more designs with it. Like, Marowak cannot be chilling with nearly 3 signature bone attacks to it. Commit to making bones a ground type thing. But ultimately, a big Earth type would be too broad because it covers too many of these categories that could cleanly be split into 2 groups. And importantly, broadness doesn't have to do with the quantity of Pokemon in that type. The Pokemon Company can simply choose to design more or less Pokemon for each type if they want to. They'll find some way to make enough designs for a good type if it exists. Like, Ice type has the least Pokemon currently at 60, but I don't think that type is too limiting. And funnily enough, combining all rock and ground Pokemon wouldn't even be the most Pokemon in a single type. There'd only be around 150 Earth-type Pokemon, which doesn't even surpass Water-type alone with 162. Although, I feel like Pokemon tries to keep type distribution fairly balanced, so having one type with so many Pokemon in it does suggest a potential issue, and yeah, that means I think Water type is too broad as well. The issue with water is that it isn't just the magical concept of the water element, but also all creatures who live in or near the water. You might realize that this is quite similar to the situation with flying. The difference there is that flying type currently doesn't have many Pokemon in it that just control the air element. Now, I want there to be more air element Pokemon designs, but I also recognized that that would create this issue of there being 2 major categories that could just be split, hence why I suggested it be a separate type. Pokemon, however, didn't take that precaution with water type. So the solution? Let's do the same thing that we did with flying. Split it into a water type and a fish type. And honestly, at first I thought there would be so many fish types that we'd be taking too many from water, but wow, there's not actually that many fish. It's slightly helped by the fact that seahorses and eels are fish, but apparently starfish and jellyfish aren't. Great naming job, guys, 10 out of 10. But yeah, only roughly a quarter of all water types are fish, so it actually works out pretty well. Of course, fish type would have basically the same problems as bird type did. It sounds a little silly, and it doesn't actually encompass all the creatures who live in the water. It would help cut down water type even more if we actually did have that arthropod type from earlier, because then we could take out all the crabs, lobsters, isopods, and barnacles, apparently. I'm learning a lot about animal categorization, but that doesn't make much of a bigger dent. The only other major category would be mollusks like octopi, clams, slugs, etc., but that's still way too small of a category to work as a whole type on its own. So changing fish type to like aquatic type would have to be the only option to fully encompass all animals who just live in the water. But this also brings back the same issues as keeping flying with air. Aquatic feels too similar to water type, and I don't know if I could justify a Pokemon being aquatic and water type. Though, in fairness, I don't think fish and water type would have made sense anyway. But maybe the idea of a creatures who live in the water type is sound. We just need a better name for it. But no, I'm actually gonna settle on fish type making the most sense here. You wanna know why? It's not a good reason. It's just because it would make sure that all starter Pokemon remain water type. We've gotten a lot of starters who are animals that live near or in the water, but somehow we haven't gotten a single fish starter, so splitting a ton of water types off into the fish type would not actually ruin any past starter Pokemon trios. Plus, this, just like the air-bird type split, could help clean up the type chart. As I said earlier, water being weak to electric is kind of arbitrary, but it makes more sense if water itself resists or is even immune to electric, while fish type was weak to it. Fish would also likely be weak to fire and ice types, whereas water obviously never could be. And fish wouldn't have to be weak against grass anymore. It could even be super effective against bug types, since a lot of fish in real life eat smaller things, and I guess worm Pokemon could be bug types. Worms aren't really bugs, they're just invertebrates. I mean, look, I could try to justify an invertebrate type with all the jellyfish and starfish Pokemon, but then we'd essentially just be reinventing the real-life animal classification system, so let's not do that. Another broad type that's a little trickier since it can't just be split into a group of animals or renamed to account for its edge cases is Psychic type. Psychic includes things that aren't all about the mind, things like space or light or just vague magic. Personally, I think that magic could probably stay under Psychic because you could argue that it connects enough to the idea of using your mind for powers, or it could even be split with Fairy pretty cleanly. But the second category, Light, is a really popular idea for a new type that, well, I guess Light type could kinda work, but I think everything Light could represent fits better in other existing types already. Mysterious lights and glowy things make up a large part of Fairy type already, and bright lights can also be a part of electricity or fire. You may think, well, the theme of light is spread across so many types, so surely that means it'd make perfect sense to be its own new type, and clean all of those other ones up. But I actually think that works against it here. Light isn't just light, there's always a source of that light, and all those sources are represented by existing types already. And even though Dark type, which would likely be Light type's counterpart, actually includes the moral idea of evilness, implying that Light type would theoretically include the moral of heroics, heroism is already a large part of Fighting type's identity, and Fighting type already kind of works as a counterpart to Dark. Honestly, the only major aspect of Light that I don't think is cleanly represented with something else is Stars, which is actually that last subcategory of Psychic type I mentioned, Space. And here's where Psychic finally stretches too thin, I think. I feel like Space/Cosmic type is one that could work quite well on its own to break that restrictive boundary that many Psychic type Pokemon push against. And by that I mean that there are already plenty of Pokemon who are clearly space-themed, or Pokemon that are explicitly from or connected to space. And nearly all of them are designated Psychic type, meaning that's just part of Psychic's identity, and hot take, I don't think cosmic powers are within the capabilities of mind readers. Unlike light or magic, which are clearly themes for some Pokemon, but aren't causing clear restrictions in designs and can fit in other typings fairly comfortably, space is very prominent and has always felt like there'd be more than enough ideas for designs if we weren't held back by the lack of a proper type to put them in. Meaning this is an area of design where we could use a new type. And on top of all of that, you can easily imagine a lot of type matchups for space, like an immunity to fire, being super effective against ground type, being resistant to flying or ice type, maybe. The ideas are there, I just wish I had more to say on it because I think this would be an incredible new type, as long as we ignore how difficult it'd be to deal with like 30% of all psychic Pokemon and moves changing to a new type. Okay, but there's one last clear theme in Pokemon designs that is consistently represented by a type that doesn't fully fit it, and is one of the most popular ideas for a new Pokemon type. Yep, that's right, it's Sound type, baby! Well, I think that realistically a Sound type wouldn't actually work. However, considering the points I've made for all of these other ideas, Sound fulfills a lot of qualifications to be a new type. Sound is already such a strong theme that many Pokemon designs are entirely based on it. More recent sound-based Pokemon designs have been made to suit other existing types, so again, realistically it'd be hard to add sound now with Pokemon like Toxtricity, who are very clearly supposed to be poison and electric, but earlier forms of sound Pokemon often just defaulted to normal type, and the majority of sound-based moves are still normal. Plus, normal still seems to be considered the default for sound nowadays, as there was an entirely new sound-based Rotom form in Pokopia, which was still given the normal type despite typing not even mattering in that game. And if normal is supposed to fulfill the category of sound, then I have a problem because it just doesn't feel like a strong theming of sound fits what is essentially the neutral category. And on the other hand, right now I wouldn't say that there are enough Pokemon who would already be sound type to justify adding it, but we don't need to rely on what Pokemon are already there. As I've alluded to already, Pokemon simply makes designs for types that exist and not types that don't. Despite that, clearly, Pokemon keeps bumping up against the issue of making sound-themed Pokemon and trying to justify them being more than normal type, so that suggests that there could be plenty of new designs if we remove this restriction. And best of all, it's pretty obvious that Space type would be immune to Sound type, and having any type matchup idea that clear-cut is just exciting. Though maybe Space would be having too many immunities at this point. Ultimately though, I don't actually know if Sound would have enough ideas to be a whole type. Yeah, there's a lot of Pokemon based on like music and stuff, so Sound would be great for those, but can you really imagine more variety than that could fulfill even 60 total Pokemon without it just all being different forms of music? Well, maybe you can, but the issue is sound is something any creature can do. That makes it hard to really decide what is sound enough to be that type over anything else. Would all bats and dolphins be sound type just because they echolocate, or does the Pokemon design have to reference sound in a specific way? It's just a little too messy. So how about an alternative? Air type. Yes, I'm re-suggesting air type. As I've said earlier, I love when Pokemon types encompass subcategories of design that still thematically work as that type. And whilst trying to deal with the issue of my bird type idea not accounting for things like bats, I realized that air would still work perfectly for Noibat and Noivern specifically because they're sound themed, and sound is just vibrations in the air. So that's perfect. That's when it hit me. The same appeal as seeing a crystal Pokemon be rock type or a fan Pokemon be flying type. Sound doesn't have to be its own whole type. I think it could be a really fun subcategory of air type, and that would work much better than it being a subcategory of normal. So there you go. That's my pitch. I've solved Pokemon. All they gotta do is start making a bunch of air elemental Pokemon who specifically don't fly, and then they'll have enough to justify a brand new type that can also better suit all those normal typed sound themed Pokemon. Or they could just keep not doing that. I think there's a case to be made that a new type would be freeing. It'd help fix some Pokemon who don't really fit their current types, and it would encourage new designs based on that new type. But at the same time, I actually do like when Pokemon stretches the boundaries of what it currently has. And just because there's a distinct subcategory within a type, that doesn't mean that it needs to be separated on its own. There's a decent handful of fungus Pokemon, and fungi aren't plants, so by definition, they shouldn't be grass types. But like, it's close enough. I don't think there will be enough unique ideas for mushroom-themed Pokemon to make it a separate type. I don't think there's enough unique ideas for arachnid Pokemon to justify that being separate from bug. And I don't think there's enough ideas for crab Pokemon to separate that from water. But at the same time, they seem to find ways to make designs for any type that does exist. Rock being separate from ground really only works now because Pokemon itself made designs with that distinction in mind. In Generation 1, I think it's pretty clear that they didn't have that distinction marked down yet. Geodude is the most pure rock-type looking Pokemon in existence. It's literally just a rock. Onix too, and even Rhydon to an extent, but they're all rock and ground type. But they later figured out what a pure rock-type Pokemon would be because they had to commit to keeping rocks separate from ground. I think an important thing to consider is, why did they make fairy type in the first place, and why wouldn't they need another? Sure, some older Pokemon turned into fairy type after it was introduced, but nowhere near enough to justify being a type with just those. It was only after fairy type was added that they started making Pokemon with that in mind, and those designs could really only work as fairy types. Well, I guess most of them could still fit into normal type, but they'd be really weird normal types, okay? Let's face it, most Pokemon fans of the time could tell that there needed to be a category for Pokemon that are kind of whimsical. That common idea of a light type, a counterpart to dark type, was that idea. The only reason they went with fairy over light is that fairy allowed for far more variety. Specifically, and one of my favorite aspects of fairy type, is that it covers the idea of fae, one of the most common European styles of mythical creature, completing the set of mythical creatures with dragon type for dragons and ghost/dark types for spirits. And this was necessary because any designs that were mystical would really only work as psychic type before, but when psychic has always been more focused on smarts than whimsy, it made sense to add a new type to broaden the horizon of designs. This isn't to say that the current list of types is perfect for creativity or anything. I actually do think that psychic and water type are still far too broad. And so a lot of Pokemon that would technically be fun stretches aren't actually clever at all. They're more just like, sure, I guess that's psychic. But I also recognize that it'd be quite hard to change that at this point. And nowadays, there's not really any major category of design that can't already be justified as one of the existing types. Fungi aren't plants, crystals aren't rocks, and space isn't a psychic power, but, well, okay, that last one actually, I think, you know what? I lied. Pokemon does need a new type. Space type, guys, come on! I am sick of space being so prominent in so many designs and yet still being considered a psychic power. You could have so many good space-themed designs to fill up the type. Its type matchups would be clever and cool too. I don't care if making a bunch of psychic-type Pokemon into new typings would have disastrous effects on the ecological balancing of pocket monsters all over the world. The longer we take, the harder it'll get to do. So do it now! If you think space type sounds too weird as a name, then we can go with cosmic type or star type or stellar type. Yeah, imagine that. A brand new Pokemon type named stellar type. Wouldn't that be something?